The summer of 1943 was a turning point in World War II. The Soviet Union, emboldened by its victory at Stalingrad and the crippling defeat of Nazi forces, was now pushing forward, determined to reclaim every inch of its territory. To the west, the Germans, still reeling from the loss of over 300,000 men in the Battle of Stalingrad, were desperate to stop the Soviet advance. It was in this climate of tension and desperation that the Battle of Kursk would unfold, a battle that would become the largest tank battle in history, and one that would shape the fate of the entire war. The stage was set. The Germans had one last chance to reclaim the initiative on the Eastern Front, and they planned to do so with a massive assault on the Soviet-held Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines. The battle was not just about tanks, it was about strategy, intelligence, and the will to fight. For both sides, Kursk would be the ultimate test. On the German side, the Wehrmacht had assembled a force of tanks and infantry that would rival anything seen before. The most formidable of these were the Tiger and Panther tanks. The Tiger, a heavily armored and heavily armed tank, was designed to punch through enemy lines, while the Panther was faster, more maneuverable, and equally deadly. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was tasked with leading the German assault, supported by General Heinz Guderian, one of the foremost tank tacticians in the world. On the Soviet side, the Red Army, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Vasily Chuikov, had learned valuable lessons from the previous battles. The Soviets had T-34 tanks, which were not as heavily armored as the German tanks, but were faster, more reliable, and easier to produce in vast numbers. The Soviet strategy was not just about fighting with tanks. It was about creating a defensive network that could absorb the German assault and then strike back with overwhelming force. The German attack, Operation Citadel, began on July 5, 1943. The plan was simple: strike at the heart of the Soviet lines, encircle the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, and destroy them. The Germans had 300,000 men at their disposal, including over 2,000 tanks. They would strike hard, break the Soviet defenses, and create the conditions for a decisive victory. At first, the Germans made progress. Their tanks and infantry pushed forward, encountering Soviet defenses that were tough but not impenetrable. But the Soviet forces were ready. Over the preceding months, they had prepared multiple layers of defenses: trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery positions, all designed to slow down or stop any attack. For the Soviets, this was their moment to prove that they had learned from previous mistakes. Marshal Zhukov had anticipated the German attack and had placed his forces in a position to absorb the blow and then counterattack. As the battle raged, the true scale of the conflict became apparent. Thousands of tanks clashed in a series of brutal engagements. The Tiger tanks, with their thick armor and powerful guns, were fearsome opponents, but the Soviets had the advantage of numbers. The T-34s, with their mobility and ease of repair, quickly became the backbone of the Soviet defense. In the first days of the battle, the Germans advanced, but their progress was slow. They had underestimated the Soviet defensive preparations and the sheer number of Soviet tanks waiting for them. What followed was a battle of attrition, with tanks and infantry locked in fierce combat. One of the pivotal moments in the tank battle came when the Soviet T-34s began to take advantage of the terrain. The Germans, whose tanks were powerful but less mobile, found themselves bogged down in the thick Russian mud, while the faster Soviet tanks could maneuver through the countryside and strike at the German flanks. After several days of fierce fighting, the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. They had waited for the Germans to exhaust themselves, and now, with their lines intact and their reserves in place, they were ready to strike back. On July the 12th, the Soviets began a series of attacks designed to break the German forces and trap them in the Kursk pocket. The Soviets struck with overwhelming force, utilizing their tank divisions and artillery to cut off the German advance. The German tanks, now deeply committed to the assault, found themselves in a perilous position. The Soviets had encircled them, and German units were now facing not just tanks, but also anti-tank guns, fighter planes, and artillery. The momentum had shifted, and the Germans were in full retreat. It was a stunning turnaround. The Soviets had successfully defended Kursk, and the Germans had failed to achieve their objective. In the aftermath of the battle, the Soviets had not only held their ground, but had inflicted a devastating defeat on the Germans. Over 250,000 Germans had been killed, wounded, or captured, while the Soviets suffered approximately 150,000 casualties. For the Germans, Kursk marked the beginning of the end on the Eastern Front. Their offensive had failed, and from that point on, they would be on the defensive, slowly retreating across Eastern Europe as Soviet forces continued their relentless push westward. The Soviets, on the other hand, were emboldened. The battle had not only been a military victory, but a psychological one. The Soviets had successfully resisted the German war machine, and their forces were now ready to continue their march toward Berlin. The Battle of Kursk remains one of the most important battles of World War II. It was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, and its failure marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The battle also highlighted the importance of intelligence, logistics, and preparation in modern warfare. Kursk was not just a victory for the Soviets, but a testament to the power of defensive strategy, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the ability of tanks to shape the outcome of a battle. It is often seen as the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets began their push toward Berlin, ultimately bringing about the fall of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Kursk proved that wars are not won with brute force alone. The battle demonstrated the importance of strategy, intelligence, and preparedness. It was a test of endurance, a contest of wills between two of the most formidable military forces in the world. In the end, it was the Soviets who emerged victorious, changing the course of World War II and ensuring that the Nazis would never recover their momentum. The Battle of Kursk was a groundbreaking event, not just for its sheer scale, but also for the profound lessons it provided on modern warfare. In the aftermath of the battle, both the Soviets and Germans took away crucial insights that would shape military tactics for years to come. The primary lesson from Kursk was the importance of defensive strategy. The Soviet defense, built meticulously over months, absorbed the German blow and exhausted their offensive capacity. The Germans, with their superior tanks and experience, expected a swift breakthrough, but they were unprepared for the Soviet depth of defense. Anti-tank positions, minefields, and Soviet air support all played pivotal roles in slowing the Germans. The Soviets did not rely solely on tanks. They integrated artillery, anti-aircraft units, and infantry to create a multi-layered defense that proved far more effective than the Germans had anticipated. The Soviet use of mobile tactics was equally groundbreaking. Once the Germans were entrenched, Soviet counterattacks were rapid and relentless. Soviet tank divisions, combined with well-coordinated infantry and artillery support, were able to exploit gaps in the German lines and encircle large numbers of German troops. The lesson here was clear. While it was important to build a strong defense, counteroffensive mobility, the ability to shift from defense to attack, was essential to breaking the enemy's momentum. The battle also emphasized the critical importance of logistics in large-scale warfare. The Germans, despite their technological advantages, were ultimately hampered by poor supply lines, which made it difficult for them to maintain their offensive. Conversely, the Soviets were able to sustain their forces through the use of intelligent logistics management and reinforcements, which played a significant role in their eventual victory. For Nazi Germany, Kursk marked the end of their offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The failure of Operation Citadel shattered the myth of German invincibility and set the stage for a dramatic shift in the war. The psychological impact on the German military was profound. After Kursk, the Germans found themselves unable to carry out any major offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The losses at Kursk, both in terms of men and equipment, left the Germans vulnerable. In the months following Kursk, German morale plummeted. The Wehrmacht's belief in quick, decisive victories was deeply shaken. The Germans had anticipated a swift breakthrough, but instead, they faced a well-prepared Soviet defense and suffered heavy losses. The failure to achieve their objectives at Kursk not only weakened German military resolve, but also severely impacted the leadership's confidence in their ability to win the war on the Eastern Front. Furthermore, the realization that the Soviets were capable of holding their ground and even inflicting a crushing counteroffensive had significant consequences for Hitler's strategic thinking. The defeat at Kursk forced the Germans to adopt a defensive posture, but it was too late. The Soviets, now with the initiative, began their own offensive operations, pushing the Germans further and further back. For the Soviet Union, the Battle of Kursk was not only a military victory, but also a psychological triumph. It confirmed their ability to withstand the most powerful military force in the world, and it solidified their resolve to continue the fight. The Soviet leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, who had been under immense pressure after early setbacks, gained renewed confidence. The victory at Kursk gave Zhukov and other Soviet commanders the momentum they needed to push forward with a series of successful offensives that would eventually lead to the capture of Berlin in 1945. Kursk also demonstrated the strength of the Soviet industrial base and their ability to produce vast quantities of tanks and weapons. The Soviets managed to field an army that could outlast the Germans in terms of both manpower and equipment. The T-34 tank, despite its technical inferiority to the German tanks in terms of armor, was produced in staggering numbers and became the backbone of the Soviet offensive. Soviet production lines were able to replace losses at a rate the Germans simply could not match. Moreover, the Soviet victory was a testament to the strength of Soviet soldiers who had endured years of hardship. After the losses at Stalingrad, many Soviet soldiers were determined to push the Nazis out of their homeland once and for all. The victory at Kursk bolstered the morale of the Soviet population and the military, and it became a rallying cry for the continued defense of the motherland. The strategic and psychological effects of the Battle of Kursk rippled across the rest of the war. By the end of the battle, the German Wehrmacht was on the defensive, and the Soviets began their long march westward, eventually reaching Berlin in 1945. Kursk marked the end of Germany's ability to launch major offensives on the Eastern Front and the beginning of a Soviet-driven push towards Germany. For the Western Allies, the Soviet victory at Kursk also had significant implications. It meant that Nazi Germany was now fighting a two-front war they could no longer sustain. While the Western Allies, led by General Eisenhower, were preparing for D-Day and the invasion of Normandy, the Soviets had already begun their own massive offensive. The Germans, exhausted by the constant pressure from the Soviet Union, would find it increasingly difficult to resist the Allied advance from both the West and the East. The success of Soviet tactics and the resilience of their forces would influence post-war military strategies, particularly in the development of combined arms warfare and defensive positioning in the face of superior technology. Soviet strategy would influence military doctrines for years to come, and the lessons learned at Kursk would shape both Cold War and modern military tactics. The Battle of Kursk remains a symbol of the brutality and scale of World War II. It was a battle of attrition, of tanks and soldiers locked in combat, with neither side willing to give an inch. But it was also a battle of resilience, of overcoming overwhelming odds and pushing forward in the face of defeat. For the Soviets, Kursk was the turning point they had been waiting for. It marked the beginning of their long march toward Berlin and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end, a desperate, costly failure that left them vulnerable to Soviet and Allied advances. Kursk was a battle of tanks, but it was also a battle of wills, a clash between two of the most powerful military forces in the world. In the end, it was Soviet determination, strategic defense, and the ability to turn defense into offense that triumphed. The battle proved that no matter how powerful the enemy, even the most formidable force can be defeated with the right tactics, preparation, and resolve. One of the most significant legacies of the Battle of Kursk was the evolution of tank warfare. Both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany introduced innovative tank designs that would influence the future of armored combat for decades to come. At Kursk, the battlefield became a proving ground for tank innovations that would shape World War II and the future of mechanized warfare. For the Germans, the Panther tank was their answer to the Soviet T-34. The Panther was designed to be faster and more maneuverable than the previous German tanks, with a more powerful 75mm gun capable of knocking out Soviet armor. The Tiger IV, with its thick armor and potent 88mm gun, was a formidable weapon that instilled fear in Soviet tank crews. However, its weight and mechanical issues limited its effectiveness in the fast-moving warfare that Patton and other commanders were embracing. On the Soviet side, the T-34 was the true star of the battle. While not as heavily armored as the German tanks, the T-34 was far superior in terms of mobility, reliability, and ease of production. Its sloped armor made it highly resistant to German gunfire, and its 75mm gun was capable of destroying German tanks at medium range. The T-34 represented the future of tank warfare. Speed and mobility combined with the ability to withstand hits that would have destroyed earlier models. Despite the technological race between the Germans and Soviets, the battle proved that quantity could overcome quality. The Soviets' ability to produce vast numbers of T-34 tanks meant they could afford to lose large amounts of their armored force and still maintain a strong fighting capability, while the Germans, despite their superior tanks, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers and lack of logistical support. The failure of Operation Citadel had profound implications for the German high command, particularly Adolf Hitler. After Kursk, the German leadership began to lose faith in the ability of the Wehrmacht to win the war on the Eastern Front. In the wake of Kursk, Hitler's strategic decisions became increasingly erratic, as his obsession with holding on to every inch of occupied territory led to a series of military blunders that would cost Germany dearly. Hitler's refusal to listen to his generals, including Manstein and Guderian, who had advocated for a more mobile and flexible defense strategy, contributed significantly to Germany's downfall. Rather than adapting to the changing conditions, Hitler insisted on holding ground at all costs, leading to catastrophic defeats at Kursk, Stalingrad, and later in the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans' inability to adapt their tactics after Kursk also revealed a fundamental flaw in Nazi military strategy: the over-reliance on quick, decisive victories and a lack of sustainable long-term planning. While the Germans had once been able to overwhelm their opponents with speed and precision, the Soviet Union's ability to adapt and replenish its forces exposed the limits of the German approach. The victory at Kursk gave the Soviets more than just a military advantage. It became a propaganda tool that helped rally the Soviet people and the Red Army to fight with even greater determination. After the devastating losses in the early years of the war, Kursk was a much-needed moral booster for the Soviet Union. The victory showed that the Germans could be defeated, and it bolstered the resolve of both the military and civilians alike. Soviet propaganda took full advantage of this victory. It portrayed the battle as a symbol of Soviet strength, depicting the Soviet people's ability to endure hardship and their capacity for total mobilization. The images of Soviet soldiers standing firm against the German onslaught were widely circulated, and Kursk became a key part of the Soviet war narrative. The triumph at Kursk not only ensured the continuation of the Soviet war effort, but also served as a rallying cry for further offensives against the Germans. The psychological impact of Kursk was also deeply felt by the German population. As Nazi Germany lost its momentum on the Eastern Front, the possibility of victory began to fade. The propaganda machine in Germany, which had once promised a swift victory in the East, struggled to explain the setbacks at Kursk, leading to doubts among the German civilian population about the possibility of a Nazi victory in the war. The lessons learned from Kursk would not only influence the remainder of World War II, but also help shape Soviet military doctrine in the Cold War. The idea that defense could turn into offense was adopted by the Soviets in their post-war military strategies, particularly in the development of their tank corps and mobilized defense tactics. After Kursk, Soviet commanders refined their doctrines of deep defense and counteroffensive strategies, ensuring that they could absorb the first blow from any enemy and then launch a decisive, overwhelming response. The success of the Red Army at Kursk also laid the groundwork for Soviet tank tactics during the Cold War, where armored divisions would become key to Soviet doctrine in both conventional warfare and nuclear warfare scenarios. The tank battles of the Cold War, such as those seen in Eastern Europe and Germany, were directly influenced by the strategies and tactics that had been developed and tested at Kursk. Soviet tank divisions, which were designed to quickly mobilize and counterattack, mirrored the Soviet tank formations that had overwhelmed the Germans at Kursk. The Battle of Kursk remains a testament to the sheer scale of total warfare. It was not just about tanks, but about the integration of logistics, air support, intelligence, and strategic defense. The battle demonstrated how technology, tactics, and human endurance could shape the course of history. The use of combined arms warfare, where different military branches worked together in unison, became a staple of military doctrine in the decades that followed. Kursk also highlighted the importance of intelligence in modern combat. Both sides used espionage, reconnaissance, and deception to gain the upper hand. The Germans had their ultras, the Soviet Union had their network of spies and informants, and both sides utilized code-breaking to anticipate and counter the enemy's movements. The Battle of Kursk was not just a battle of tanks. It was a battle that tested every aspect of military strategy, from intelligence and logistics to psychology and adaptability. It was the culmination of years of experience, mistakes, and lessons learned from the war up until that point. It was a battle that would change the course of history. For the Soviets, Kursk was a victory that signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the Germans, it was a defeat that marked the beginning of their retreat on the Eastern Front. The lessons learned at Kursk would not just shape the rest of the war, but also the nature of modern warfare. As we look back at the Battle of Kursk, we see more than just a clash of tanks. We see a turning point in history, a reminder of the sacrifice, the courage, and the determination of those who fought for the future of their countries. The lessons learned at Kursk would not remain confined to the period of World War II alone. In the post-war years, tank warfare would continue to evolve as a central element of military doctrine in both the Soviet Union and the Western world. The Cold War era would see a sharp increase in the use of armored forces, as both superpowers sought to secure their influence across Europe and the world. But the strategies honed at Kursk would set the foundation for modern armored warfare. The Soviet Union's post-war doctrine of deep operations was heavily influenced by the Soviet success at Kursk. The idea of encircling the enemy, combined with massive tank offensives supported by artillery and infantry, became a staple of Soviet military planning throughout the Cold War. The Soviet T-55 and later the T-72 were direct descendants of the T-34, built for fast mobile warfare with an emphasis on shock action against enemy forces, much like the Soviet tactics used in the Kursk counteroffensive. On the other side, NATO forces, especially the United States and West Germany, took note of the German tactical failure at Kursk. The importance of logistics, intelligence, and tactical flexibility would become central tenets of NATO's defensive strategy in the Cold War, particularly as the West prepared for a potential conflict with the Warsaw Pact. Kursk demonstrated the cost of underestimating the enemy and the importance of preparedness on both offense and defense. The Battle of Kursk has continued to be a critical study in military academies across the world, particularly in tank warfare. Many modern armies, including NATO, Russia, and China, study the battle to understand the dynamics of armor engagements, defensive tactics, and counteroffensive operations. At military schools like the United States Military Academy at West Point, Kursk is often cited as one of the most important examples of the interaction between tanks, infantry, and artillery in modern warfare. The success of Soviet defenses at Kursk highlights the importance of preparation and defense in depth, and how combined arms tactics can overwhelm a superior enemy force if executed correctly. Kursk also shows how communication and coordination between different military branches, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air forces, are critical for success in large-scale battles. These lessons, derived from Kursk, are evident in modern conflicts such as the Gulf War and Iraq War, where rapid armored movements were central to decisive victories. The psychological toll that Kursk took on the German military cannot be overstated. By the time the battle was over, the Wehrmacht had suffered irreplaceable losses in both men and machinery. After Kursk, the German war effort was permanently weakened. Their failure to break through the Soviet defenses demonstrated that the Soviet Union was no longer on the defensive, and the Nazis could no longer push them back with their superior technology. What followed was a steady stream of defeats that culminated in the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, which further fragmented Germany's front lines. The loss at Kursk made it clear that Nazi Germany could no longer win the war. The battle shattered the myth of German invincibility, which had been carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, and in doing so, it undermined the morale of the German military and civilian population. For the Soviets, Kursk had a different impact. It cemented their belief in their ability to win the war, and it gave the Red Army a sense of inevitability that would drive them all the way to Berlin. The defeat of the German offensive meant that the Soviets would now be on the offensive, and they would not stop until they had pushed the Nazis from their homeland and beyond. The Battle of Kursk was more than just a military victory. It was a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The German defeat at Kursk signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Germans were now forced to defend their territory against a resurgent Soviet army that would not stop until they reached the heart of Germany itself. From Kursk, the Soviets marched forward with relentless momentum, and the Nazis began their inexorable retreat. For the Soviets, Kursk was the triumph of resilience and strategy. It was a victory that demonstrated the Soviet ability to adapt and counterattack with overwhelming force. And, importantly, it marked the shift in the balance of power from Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union. In the larger scope of the war, Kursk was a decisive moment that helped pave the way for the Allied victory in Europe. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, the Soviets had already gained the upper hand in the East. Kursk ensured that Germany's resources were stretched to their breaking point, and that the Soviets could push further into Nazi-occupied territory without the same level of resistance they had faced earlier in the war. The Battle of Kursk is remembered as one of the most significant and decisive battles of World War II. It remains a powerful reminder of the complexity and scale of the conflict, as well as the critical importance of strategy, logistics, and defense in modern warfare. In popular culture, Kursk is often overshadowed by other iconic battles, such as Normandy or Stalingrad. But its significance is profound. The sheer scale of the battle, the loss of life, and the technological innovations introduced during the conflict all make Kursk a pivotal moment in the history of warfare. Today, Kursk is still studied by military historians, tacticians, and scholars as an example of combined arms warfare and the importance of tactical flexibility. The lessons of the battle, particularly the importance of defense in depth, logistical support, and counteroffensive operations, continue to inform military strategy around the world. The Battle of Kursk was not just a clash of tanks. It was a battle that showcased the critical importance of logistics, intelligence, and coordination across all military arms. These elements, which were crucial in Kursk, would become staples of military strategy in subsequent conflicts. One of the greatest lessons learned from Kursk was the value of intelligence gathering and its role in shaping the outcome of battles. Both the Soviets and Germans relied heavily on espionage, code-breaking, and reconnaissance. The Soviets, for example, used the information from their spies within Germany to anticipate the timing and scale of the German assault. This information was crucial in preparing the Soviet defenses in advance, allowing them to fortify the Kursk salient and create a more efficient defensive setup. On the other hand, the Germans were hampered by the inability to break Soviet codes and gather adequate intelligence about Soviet dispositions. The importance of logistical support became painfully clear during the battle. The Germans, despite having superior tanks, struggled with overextended supply lines and mechanical failures. Their tanks, such as the Tiger I, were powerful but cumbersome and prone to mechanical breakdowns, especially under the pressure of constant combat. In contrast, the Soviets were able to produce and deploy T-34s at an overwhelming pace. The ability to replace lost vehicles at a rapid rate was a significant factor in the Soviet success at Kursk. The Soviets' logistical superiority was rooted in their ability to maintain the flow of ammunition, reinforcements, and tanks, even when German forces were relentlessly attacking. In the aftermath of Kursk, logistics and intelligence became central to military doctrine across the world. Modern tank armies and combined arms strategies, which integrate different branches of the military into a cohesive fighting force, owe much to the lessons learned at Kursk. Kursk had a lasting influence not just on World War II, but also on the dynamics of the Cold War that would follow. The Soviet Union's victory at Kursk helped to cement its status as a military superpower by showing the world that it could defeat the German war machine in open battle. This victory was crucial for Soviet morale, and it contributed to the USSR's global ambitions after the war, particularly in Eastern Europe and Asia. As the Cold War unfolded, the Soviets relied on the tank strategies perfected at Kursk to defend against NATO forces. Soviet military planners emphasized the importance of fast-moving tank divisions, similar to the Soviet tactics used at Kursk to break through enemy lines. The lessons learned in Kursk would directly influence Soviet military doctrine throughout the Cold War, particularly in their approach to conventional warfare and their preparation for a possible confrontation with NATO forces. For NATO, the Soviet success at Kursk was a reminder of the danger of underestimating an enemy and the importance of maintaining supply lines and tactical flexibility. NATO forces, especially those of West Germany, studied Kursk to understand how their tanks and forces could effectively counter Soviet tactics. The Panther and Tiger tanks, while formidable, were heavy and not as adaptable as the T-34, and NATO forces realized that flexibility, mobility, and quick response times were essential to counter the Soviet threat. This shift in military doctrine was evident in Cold War tank battles, including the development of NATO's M1 Abrams and the Soviet T-80, which both reflected the lessons learned at Kursk: speed, firepower, and reliability in armored units. One of the lasting effects of Kursk was its psychological impact on both the Soviets and the Germans. For the Soviets, the victory at Kursk represented more than just a military triumph. It was a symbol of their ability to stand up to the seemingly invincible Nazi war machine. It proved that Nazi Germany could be defeated in open combat, and it galvanized Soviet resolve to continue the fight all the way to Berlin. The defeat at Kursk, however, had a far more devastating psychological effect on the Germans. Adolf Hitler's strategic miscalculation at Kursk demonstrated that Germany's offensive capabilities were no longer viable. The battle shattered the myth of German invincibility, and it marked the beginning of the German retreat from the Eastern Front. The failure of Operation Citadel made it clear to both the German military leadership and civilian population that the war on the Eastern Front was lost. German morale plunged, and the Wehrmacht began to feel the strain of defending multiple fronts as Soviet forces began pushing them back. For Hitler, Kursk was a personal blow to his leadership. His insistence on a decisive, all-out offensive, despite the warnings of his generals, had led to a humiliating defeat. His obsession with holding territory and sacrificing soldiers for small gains ultimately played a role in his downfall. The failure at Kursk would haunt him for the rest of the war, and after Kursk, the Germans were never able to regain their previous momentum. Kursk was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. After the battle, the German military was forced into a defensive posture, and from that point on, the Soviets were in the driver's seat. The defeat at Kursk showed that Germany no longer had the capacity to launch successful large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. Soviet advances from Kursk onward were unstoppable. By the fall of 1944, the Red Army had crossed into Poland, and Berlin was in sight. The Soviets continued their relentless march, using the momentum gained at Kursk to push westward, liberating Eastern Europe and ultimately capturing Berlin in May 1945. The victory at Kursk not only ensured Soviet superiority in the east, but also gave the Allied forces in the west the confidence to proceed with the Normandy invasion and cross the Rhine. Kursk, then, was more than a battle between tanks. It was a watershed moment in the larger war. It marked the last significant attempt by the Wehrmacht to regain the initiative in the east, and its failure set the stage for the Allied victory in Europe. The Battle of Kursk stands as one of the most decisive and monumental battles in military history. Its legacy lives on not just in the stories of courage and sacrifice, but in the tactical lessons it taught both military forces and strategists around the world. From the Soviet tank tactics to the logistical superiority of modern militaries, the Battle of Kursk proved that technology, intelligence, and defensive strategy could triumph over superior force when executed with precision. Kursk was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the war, the moment the Soviets turned the tide and set the stage for the end of Nazi Germany. It changed the nature of armored warfare and shaped the way future conflicts would be fought. Even today, modern military doctrine draws inspiration from the battle's innovations in combined arms tactics, tank warfare, and the importance of logistics. As we reflect on the lessons of Kursk, we are reminded of the cost of war, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the strategic shifts it brings about, shaping the future of global politics and military operations for generations to come. While the Battle of Kursk was undeniably one of the largest and most impactful tank battles in history, it also marked the point where armored warfare became an essential part of modern military strategy. The success of Soviet tank divisions and the failure of the German blitzkrieg tactics revealed critical weaknesses and strengths in tank warfare that would influence military doctrines around the world for decades. After Kursk, tank warfare would evolve beyond just brute strength. It became clear that speed, maneuverability, and coordination between various military arms were just as important, if not more so, than sheer firepower. The Soviets' use of T-34s at Kursk demonstrated the effectiveness of lighter, faster tanks that could outmaneuver the heavier German vehicles. The Panther and Tiger I tanks, while powerful, were too slow and often bogged down by mechanical failures or poor logistical support. The Soviet T-34 was a key example of how tank technology could be optimized for mass production and mobility. Its sloped armor and powerful 76.2-meter gun made it effective against the German tanks, and the Soviet emphasis on large-scale tank production allowed them to replace losses quickly, something the Germans could not do as effectively. This lesson would carry over into the post-war period, with both Western and Soviet militaries focusing on developing tank forces that could rapidly respond to battlefield situations. The legacy of Kursk in modern tank battles is visible in conflicts like the Gulf War, where the lessons of mobility, speed, and combined arms tactics were key to success. After Kursk, the Soviet Union found itself in a position of strength, and this victory had far-reaching consequences for the Cold War. Kursk was not just a military victory, it was also a symbol of Soviet resilience. With the Germans now on the defensive, the Soviet leadership was emboldened and began pushing westward, gaining ground across Eastern Europe. In the aftermath of Kursk, the Soviet Union accelerated its military buildup and started laying the groundwork for a global ideological struggle against the West. The lessons learned from Kursk, particularly the emphasis on defensive preparation and strategic counteroffensive, influenced Soviet military strategies throughout the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Soviets' development of the T-55 and later the T-72 tank reflected the technological legacy of the T-34 and Kursk's emphasis on speed, reliability, and mass production. These tanks were not only cheap to produce, but also designed for rapid maneuvering in a potential confrontation with NATO forces. The success of Kursk, combined with subsequent Soviet victories, established the Soviet Union as a major military power on the world stage. The strategic principles of deep defense and counteroffensive tactics that proved successful at Kursk were mirrored by the Warsaw Pact in their defense strategies throughout the Cold War, particularly during the Berlin crisis and the Czech invasion. Soviet forces were prepared to absorb an initial attack from NATO and counterattack with overwhelming force, a concept that had been forged in the fires of Kursk. On the other side, NATO forces, particularly those in West Germany, took note of the outcome of Kursk and adapted their tactics and strategies accordingly. The German defeat at Kursk demonstrated that even the most powerful tanks could be overcome with sufficient numbers and strategic preparation. The West responded by refining their own armored tactics and focusing on flexibility and counterattack capabilities. After Kursk, The American and British armies focused on the development of anti-tank weapons, including the M1 Abrams tank, which would be used in future conflicts. The focus was not just on having the most powerful armor, but on creating a balanced system that integrated speed, mobility, and firepower. These lessons would prove invaluable in later conflicts, such as the Korean War, Vietnam War, and Gulf War. Moreover, the Cold War brought about NATO's commitment to maintaining strategic reserves and logistical superiority in the face of a potential Soviet threat. Kursk had shown that defensive preparation and counter-offensive capabilities were essential to defeating a much larger and potentially overwhelming enemy. The Battle of Kursk was not only a military clash, but also a battle of wills. Both sides were determined to achieve victory, and it was this unwavering resolve that ultimately defined the outcome of the battle. For the Soviets, Kursk was a monumental victory that proved the EU could withstand and counteract the full force of the German war machine. It was a moment of redemption and triumph, as Soviet forces, once considered inferior by the Nazis, stood tall against the German juggernaut. The psychological impact of this victory was immense, boosting Soviet morale and resolve for the remaining years of the war. For the Germans, Kursk represented the shattering of the myth of Nazi invincibility. Despite the superior technology of their tanks, the Germans could not overcome the Soviet defensive lines. Kursk was the beginning of a steady decline for the Wehrmacht, with each subsequent battle showing the limitations of their strategy. The German morale took a severe blow, and by the time of their retreat from the Eastern Front, the psychological impact of Kursk had already left its mark on both the German civilian population and the Nazi leadership. In modern warfare, many of the lessons from Kursk still resonate today. The combined arms tactics employed by both sides at Kursk, integrating tank divisions, infantry, artillery, and air support, are still foundational to military strategy. Kursk demonstrated the importance of coordination across different military branches and the ability to conduct joint operations that overwhelm the enemy through combined arms. The tank remains a critical component of modern military operations, with advancements in armament, armor, and mobility taking inspiration from the T-34 and Panther designs. Modern tanks such as the M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 owe much of their design to the principles established at Kursk. The emphasis on maneuverability and reliability continues to guide tank development in modern armies. Kursk also showed that supply lines are just as important as combat units. Armies that can maintain their logistics chains and supply routes are better positioned to win prolonged engagements. Today's armies, whether in NATO or the Soviet successor states, continue to emphasize supply chain management and logistical support to maintain their fighting power during long campaigns. Kursk was more than just a pivotal moment in the Eastern Front. It had profound implications that would echo throughout the Cold War and the development of modern global politics. The Soviet victory at Kursk demonstrated not just military might, but also the resolve of the Soviet people and military leadership. The success of Soviet forces at Kursk emboldened the Soviet Union's position on the world stage. It marked the definitive shift in the Eastern Front and set the Soviet Union on a path of increased influence in Eastern Europe and beyond. By 1945, Soviet forces had liberated large parts of Europe and helped establish puppet regimes in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, territories that would form part of the Warsaw Pact in the following decades. The Soviet victory at Kursk helped to cement the Soviet Union's superpower status in the Cold War years. The USSR's military and strategic successes on the Eastern Front were used as propaganda tools to justify Soviet expansionism. The victory at Kursk, coupled with the triumphs at Stalingrad and the Battle of Berlin, became key pillars in the narrative of Soviet strength and resilience, which was essential in its geopolitical contest with the United States during the Cold War. While Kursk reinforced the Soviet strategic credibility, the German defeat also fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. As the Nazi regime collapsed, the Allied forces, including the United States, began to reshape Europe under new political dynamics, leading to the eventual division of Europe into NATO and the Warsaw Pact blocs. The Soviets' victory on the Eastern Front, in combination with the American industrial power and influence, set the stage for the division of the world into competing ideologies of capitalism and communism. The technological advancements seen at Kursk would extend far beyond tanks and artillery. As the war progressed, both the United States and the Soviet Union would begin to invest heavily in the development of nuclear weapons, a technology that would ultimately shape the Cold War and the nature of future warfare. The Soviets, with their success at Kursk and the later victories on the Eastern Front, sought to create a powerful deterrent against any possible Western aggression. This effort culminated in the development of atomic weapons, beginning in the aftermath of World War II, as the Manhattan Project demonstrated the incredible power of nuclear technology. The United States had already used atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, but Soviet development of their own nuclear program began shortly after. Kursk, as a symbol of Soviet resilience and capability, set the psychological stage for the Soviet Union's investment in atomic research. The development of nuclear weapons would, over time, become an integral part of the geopolitical and military landscape. The Cold War rivalry, underpinned by the threat of nuclear war, was deeply influenced by the perceived military superiority gained by both sides in the wake of their experiences in World War II. And Kursk was part of that foundation. While nuclear weapons didn't directly play a role in Kursk, the lessons of technological innovation, tactical superiority, and military mobilization from the battle would carry over into the arms race that defined the Cold War. Nuclear arms became the ultimate symbol of power and control, and the Soviet victory at Kursk reinforced their drive for global dominance in military and strategic matters. For the Soviet Union, Kursk became more than just a military victory. It became a symbol of Soviet strength and the ability to resist and overcome even the most formidable forces. After the defeat at Stalingrad, Kursk represented a key turning point. It was the moment when the Soviet Union's resolve was no longer questioned. This victory reinforced the belief that no matter the odds, the Soviet Union could and would overcome the enemy. Kursk was a testament to the endurance and sacrifice of the Soviet people and military. In the years that followed, it was celebrated in Soviet propaganda as a triumph of the people's strength and the party's leadership. The myth of Nazi invincibility was destroyed at Kursk, and the Soviets emerged with a renewed sense of pride and morale. Moreover, the Soviet home front, which had been under immense strain due to the German occupation of large parts of the Soviet Union, now had a significant victory to rally around. Kursk became a rallying cry, a reminder of what could be achieved with determination and unity. This shift in morale would be crucial as the Soviets advanced towards Germany, ensuring that they could maintain the strength to endure the battles to come. Nazi Germany, on the other hand, began to experience a crisis of morale after Kursk. The battle shattered the illusion of invulnerability that had been cultivated through Nazi propaganda. The idea that the Wehrmacht was an unstoppable force was now called into question. This defeat, combined with the previous failure at Stalingrad, showed that Nazi Germany was no longer capable of winning the war. As Soviet forces began their counteroffensives, the psychological toll on the German military leadership and population would only grow. As the battle raged in Kursk, Adolf Hitler and his generals hoped that the offensive would give Germany the edge it needed to turn the war in their favor. They believed that by dealing a crushing blow to the Soviet forces, they could regain the strategic initiative and push back Soviet advances. However, the defeat at Kursk marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Germans never fully recovered from the losses sustained at Kursk. Over 250,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Tanks and equipment were lost, and the German morale plummeted. The battle exposed the weaknesses of the German military, particularly their inability to sustain offensive operations and maintain supply lines, as well as their over-reliance on elite units like the SS Panzer divisions. In contrast, the Soviets, having gained a significant psychological and military advantage, were able to capitalize on the Germans' weaknesses and push forward. Within a year, the Red Army would have liberated Eastern Europe and would be poised to launch the final assault on Berlin in 1945. The success at Kursk was the first step in what would become the Soviet liberation of Europe. By the time of D-Day in 1944, Nazi Germany was no longer in a position to threaten the Allied forces. Kursk was a reminder to the Allied powers that the Soviets were a force to be reckoned with, and as the war progressed, the balance of power began to shift decisively in favor of the Allies. As we reflect on the Battle of Kursk, we see more than just a pivotal tank battle. It was a battle that changed the course of World War II, a moment that not only shifted the momentum of the war, but also reshaped military strategy for the future. Kursk showed that even the most powerful military forces could be defeated through preparation, resilience, and adaptability. It demonstrated the importance of logistics, intelligence, and psychological resilience in warfare. It also highlighted the evolution of tank warfare and combined arms tactics, which continue to shape modern military doctrine. The Soviet victory at Kursk ensured the downfall of Nazi Germany and marked the beginning of the Soviet Union's rise as a superpower in the post-war era. It shaped the Cold War, influenced military strategies worldwide, and left an enduring legacy in the history of global conflict. Kursk was a battle of tanks, but more than that, it was a testament to the power of willpower, strategy, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The lessons learned on the fields of Kursk continue to resonate in modern warfare and will forever be remembered as a turning point in the struggle for global domination during the Second World War. The success of Soviet forces at Kursk had lasting effects on the development of Soviet military doctrine and its influence throughout the Cold War. Kursk was a defining moment that shaped Soviet thinking about combined arms operations, deep defense strategies, and counteroffensive tactics. These lessons were adapted and refined during the Cold War as the Soviet Union looked to counter the growing threat from NATO. The idea of defensive depth, the ability to absorb an initial strike and then counterattack with overwhelming force, was heavily influenced by Soviet tactics at Kursk. This principle would be applied in later Soviet confrontations, including the Warsaw Pact's military planning during the Cold War. The Soviet Union's massive mechanized units and their ability to move large numbers of tanks and infantry into battle rapidly were a direct result of lessons learned at Kursk. The Soviet use of tanks during the battle would set the stage for the production of more advanced armored vehicles. Tanks like the T-55, T-72, and T-80 were direct descendants of the T-34 that performed so well at Kursk. These tanks would dominate Eastern European battlefields for decades, playing a significant role in the Cold War standoff between the Soviet Union and the West. Kursk also showed the importance of mass production and the ability to sustain operations with overwhelming numbers. The Soviets' industrial base allowed them to produce tanks and vehicles faster than the Germans could replace their losses. This would become one of the key elements in Soviet military strength, especially in the tank-heavy battles of the Cold War, such as in Czechoslovakia and Germany. The Battle of Kursk marked a significant technological moment in tank warfare, with both sides using their best tanks in a high-stakes confrontation. The technological lessons learned here not only influenced tank development in the immediate post-war period, but also played a major role in shaping military technology throughout the rest of the century. At Kursk, the Germans introduced some of their most advanced technology, including the Tiger and Panther tanks. While these tanks were superior in terms of firepower and armor, their mechanical problems and limited mobility proved to be a disadvantage. Panther tanks, in particular, suffered from a number of technical failures, while the Tiger was slow and prone to breakdowns in rough terrain. The battle at Kursk showed that while heavy firepower and armor could deliver a significant punch, mobility and reliability were just as important on the modern battlefield. On the Soviet side, the T-34 tank, which was more reliable and maneuverable, proved to be a key factor in the Soviet victory. The T-34 had sloped armor, making it highly resistant to incoming fire, and its reliability on the battlefield made it the most effective tank of the war. The success of the T-34 at Kursk solidified its place as the Soviet Union's primary tank, which would later influence the development of post-war Soviet armor. Anti-tank technology also saw significant development as a result of Kursk. The battle demonstrated that tanks could be vulnerable to well-coordinated anti-tank weapons and artillery. This led to the development of more effective anti-tank guns, such as the Pak-40 used by the Germans and the ZS-3 used by the Soviets. These weapons would go on to influence tank engagements in later wars, such as the Korean War and the Six-Day War. For the Soviet Union, Kursk became a powerful symbol of national resilience and victory. Following the early hardships of the war, including the devastating defeat at Stalingrad, the Soviets used Kursk to rally both the military and the people. The battle became a cornerstone of Soviet propaganda, and the victory was used to demonstrate that the Nazi invaders could be defeated, no matter how powerful they seemed. After the war, Kursk was remembered as one of the most heroic battles fought by the Red Army. Soviet officials and historians celebrated Kursk as a key turning point in the war, a moment when the Soviet Union's strength and determination turned the tide of the conflict on the Eastern Front. The battle was immortalized in Soviet films, books, and military monuments, with many focusing on the heroism of the Soviet tank crews, infantry, and commanders. The Soviet victory at Kursk also became a rallying cry for Soviet nationalism and pride. It was a victory not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the Soviet people. The ability of the Soviet Union to withstand the devastating Nazi assault and then turn the tide through resilience and strategy was presented as proof of the Soviet system's superiority. For Nazi Germany, the failure at Kursk marked a psychological turning point. Until this battle, the German military had been riding a wave of successes, having conquered much of Europe and North Africa. But Kursk shattered the illusion of German military invincibility. The battle revealed the vulnerability of the German strategy and the limits of their military technology. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was no longer on the offensive. The loss at Kursk meant the Germans were forced into a defensive position for the remainder of the war. The inability to achieve victory in such a critical battle was a huge blow to Nazi Germany's morale, and it shifted the momentum of the war to the Soviets and the Allies. German generals began to question the leadership of Adolf Hitler, who had insisted on Operation Citadel despite warnings from his military advisors. The defeat at Kursk exposed the flaws in Hitler's strategy and his inability to adapt to changing conditions on the battlefield. The consequences for Nazi Germany's leadership were devastating. Kursk marked the end of any real hope for a German victory in the East. From this point onward, the Germans would be in full retreat. Hitler's grip on the war effort would weaken, and the Wehrmacht would continue to face greater and greater losses as the Soviets, now emboldened, began to advance westward. The Battle of Kursk is remembered not just as a military clash, but as a turning point in the history of warfare. It demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility, defensive preparedness, and logistical sustainability. The lessons learned at Kursk would influence modern tank warfare and military doctrines for decades, shaping the tactics and technology that would define Cold War confrontations and modern armored conflicts. Today, the battle is often cited in military academies and strategic studies as one of the most important examples of how tanks, infantry, and artillery can work in tandem to achieve victory, especially when combined with effective defensive strategies. Kursk also remains an iconic symbol of resilience, adaptability, and sacrifice, qualities that are still valued in military leadership and modern conflict resolution. The Battle of Kursk was not only a decisive event in World War II, but also a key moment that influenced military strategy for decades to come. The success of the Soviets at Kursk demonstrated that defensive warfare, combined with the ability to absorb an attack and quickly transition to an offensive, could lead to victory even against a technologically superior enemy. This lesson became an essential part of military doctrine worldwide. In the years following World War II, defensive tactics like those used by the Soviets at Kursk were adopted by various military powers, especially in terms of deep defensive lines and fortified positions. The lessons of counteroffensive operations, where one side successfully turns the tide after a defensive phase, became a critical principle in Cold War-era military strategy. The Soviet military continued to refine this doctrine in the face of growing NATO forces, particularly in the Warsaw Pact nations. For the Allies, especially the United States, Kursk provided valuable insights into how armored divisions, artillery, and air support could be integrated into modern warfare. This concept of combined arms operations, demonstrated so clearly in the Kursk battle, became a staple in the creation of post-war military strategy, influencing future battles and wars in the Middle East, Korea, and Vietnam. In modern warfare, the importance of logistics as demonstrated at Kursk cannot be overstated. Supply chains, often considered an afterthought in earlier conflicts, became a central focus for military strategists worldwide. Kursk showed that the ability to sustain operations, even in the face of constant combat attrition, was just as crucial as the effectiveness of the fighting forces themselves. In the wake of Kursk and the subsequent Soviet victory on the Eastern Front, the post-World War II political landscape in Europe was forever altered. Kursk symbolized not just a military victory, but the growing divide between East and West. As the Soviet Union advanced further into Central and Eastern Europe, the idea of a divided Europe began to take shape. The Soviets, having repelled the Nazi invasion and advanced through Eastern Europe, began to impose Soviet-style governments across the region. The success at Kursk provided a clear message. The Soviets were not just a regional power, they were a superpower capable of defeating the Nazis and shaping the future of Europe. With the Red Army marching westward, the Soviet Union was able to cement its domination in much of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany was on the verge of collapse, and as Soviet forces pushed through Poland and Germany, Allied forces led by the United States, Great Britain, and other nations focused on the liberation of Western Europe. The failure at Kursk was one of the catalysts for the eventual defeat of the Third Reich, and it set the stage for the division of Europe into two ideologically opposed blocs, the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union. The tensions between these two sides would define the Cold War, as both superpowers sought to extend their influence over Europe and the world. The lessons learned at Kursk about the importance of defensive preparation and counteroffensive strategy influenced the military strategies of both the Soviet Union and NATO. The Soviet Union's rapid advance through Europe, bolstered by their victory at Kursk, created a situation where NATO forces had to adapt their strategies to counter Soviet aggression. For both Soviets and Germans, the legacy of Kursk was far more than just a military clash. It was a symbol of resilience, heroism, and the cost of war. The battle became a central part of Soviet propaganda in the years following the war, portraying it as a definitive turning point in the struggle against Nazi Germany. For the Soviets, Kursk became a source of national pride. The victory over the Germans, who had once been seen as an unstoppable force, reinforced the moral superiority of the Soviet communist system and provided a rallying cry for the Soviet people. The battle was celebrated annually through military parades, monuments, and films, portraying it as a symbol of the Soviet working class's ability to defeat external oppressors. For the German military, however, Kursk was a stark reminder of their failure. The Wehrmacht never fully recovered from the losses sustained at Kursk. The battle not only marked the end of Germany's offensive capability, but also exposed the fundamental flaws in Nazi strategy. For the German people, Kursk signaled the beginning of the end of the war. In the years following the defeat, German war veterans would carry the psychological weight of Kursk, the loss of the Eastern Front, and the subsequent Allied invasion. Kursk's place in history became a key point of reflection for both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. As Russia and the former Soviet states continue to honor the Soviet victory, Kursk remains a symbol of Soviet military prowess. While, for the German people, it remains a painful reminder of the limits of Nazi aggression and the futility of their failed strategies. The lessons from Kursk about the integration of tank warfare, artillery, air support, and infantry into modern combat continue to resonate in today's military strategies. The conflict at Kursk showed the world how a massive battle could be fought not just by relying on superior firepower, but by using flexible tactics, logistics, and a well-coordinated attack across multiple fronts. The concept of combined arms warfare, demonstrated so effectively at Kursk, is now a staple in modern military doctrine. Armies around the world continue to adopt and refine these tactics. The integration of modern infantry, armor, and air support has become essential in modern military operations, particularly in high-intensity conflicts like the Gulf War, the War on Terror, and in proxy wars. Moreover, Kursk's impact on military technology, from the T-34 and Panther tanks to the development of more advanced anti-tank weapons, has shaped the course of armored combat in the 21st century. The military-industrial complex in both Russia and NATO has continued to develop new technologies based on the lessons of Kursk, particularly the need for tank versatility, improved firepower, and greater mobility in combined operations. As we reflect on the Battle of Kursk, we see a defining moment in the history of World War II that goes far beyond just tanks and artillery. It was a battle that involved strategy, psychology, logistics, and resilience. The impact of Kursk can be seen in the military developments that followed, the psychological toll it had on both Soviet and German forces, and the political changes that emerged in its wake. Kursk was not just about the clash of two armies. It was about the future of Eastern Europe, the course of global politics, and the nature of modern warfare. The Soviet victory at Kursk marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and shifted the balance of power in Europe, eventually leading to the Cold War. It demonstrated that resilience, adaptation, and strategy are the true keys to victory in war. The legacy of Kursk endures in modern military doctrines, tank warfare, and the political landscape of Europe. It was a victory that would resonate for decades, shaping the global balance of power and ensuring that the Soviet Union remained a superpower in the post-war world. After World War II, the battlefields of Europe were forever altered, and Kursk played a pivotal role in shaping the new geopolitical realities. The Soviet victory at Kursk not only ensured the Soviet Union's dominance in the Eastern Front, but it also positioned the Soviet Union as one of the two superpowers of the post-war world. The battle marked the beginning of the Soviet offensive, a campaign that would continue until the fall of Berlin in 1945. For the Nazi regime, Kursk represented a crushing defeat and a sign that the Third Reich's ambitions were doomed. The German retreat from Kursk marked the start of a series of German withdrawals that would eventually culminate in the collapse of Nazi Germany. Kursk was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, both militarily and psychologically, and as Soviet forces continued their advance westward, they effectively established Soviet control over much of Eastern Europe. This Soviet advance eventually led to the division of Europe into two competing ideological blocs, the Soviet-controlled East and the capitalist West, under the leadership of NATO and the United States. The division would become entrenched during the Cold War, with the Iron Curtain symbolizing the ideological, military, and political divide between the Soviets and the Western Allies. The Soviet Union's success at Kursk set the stage for Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe and provided the USSR with significant leverage in the Cold War that would follow. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism that defined the Cold War had its roots in Kursk. The Soviet victory symbolized the resilience of the Soviet people and their ability to defeat the Nazi war machine, thereby positioning the Soviet Union as the leading force in the communist bloc. In contrast, Germany's defeat at Kursk was one of the factors that led to the emergence of the US and NATO as the dominant powers in the Western world, further solidifying the divide that would define post-war Europe. For the Soviets, the Battle of Kursk became an iconic symbol of Soviet strength and resilience. In the years following the war, Kursk was immortalized as one of the most significant Soviet victories, and it became an essential part of the Soviet narrative of triumph over fascism. The battle's outcome was widely publicized in Soviet propaganda, with images of Soviet soldiers and tank crews becoming symbols of the heroic Soviet effort to liberate Eastern Europe from Nazi oppression. In the post-war era, Kursk was celebrated in Soviet films, posters, and military parades. The Soviet Union used the victory as a rallying cry for its people, reinforcing the image of the Red Army as an indomitable force capable of defeating the most powerful enemy on Earth. Kursk, alongside victories at Stalingrad and the Battle of Berlin, became a cornerstone of Soviet military pride. Kursk's symbolic importance remained prominent in Soviet culture, serving as a testament to the strength of the Soviet people and their commitment to defeating fascism. The victory at Kursk, as portrayed in Soviet propaganda, symbolized the superiority of Soviet socialism and the ultimate victory of the working class over the forces of imperialism and fascism. For Germany, however, Kursk was a painful reminder of their failure on the Eastern Front. The battle shattered the myth of Nazi military supremacy and exposed the flaws in the Nazi strategy. For the German people and the Wehrmacht, the defeat at Kursk represented the beginning of the end. It revealed that Nazi Germany was not invincible and that their military doctrine was no longer capable of achieving victory against the Soviet Union. While Kursk is often remembered in Germany as part of the broader narrative of German defeat in the war, it also became a symbol of resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The failure at Kursk left a deep scar on the German military psyche, and it became one of the defining moments in the collapse of the Nazi war effort. In the years following the war, German war veterans and historical accounts would reflect on Kursk as a turning point in the war. It represented a moment when the Nazis' aggressive tactics on the Eastern Front came to a screeching halt. While Soviet victory was celebrated, German defeat served as a bitter reminder of the Nazi regime's flaws and its eventual downfall. The lessons learned from the Battle of Kursk continue to influence modern military training and strategic thought. Kursk remains a key study in military academies around the world, particularly when it comes to understanding combined arms warfare, tank tactics, and defensive strategies. Modern military forces, including those of Russia, the United States, and NATO, study the battle to understand the dynamics of tank combat, infantry support, and artillery coordination. At military schools like the United States Military Academy at West Point, Kursk is frequently used to illustrate the importance of logistics, intelligence, and coordination between different military arms. The battle provides an example of how even the most technologically advanced armies can be defeated if they fail to consider the wider strategic picture, including the importance of supply lines and tactical flexibility. Modern tank warfare has evolved significantly since Kursk, but the fundamental principles of maneuver warfare, speed, and firepower remain at the core of armored tactics. Kursk demonstrated the importance of mobility and adaptability in tank warfare, which is why modern armored units still prioritize these qualities when engaging in battle. As we reflect on Kursk, we see more than just a monumental tank battle. It was a turning point that reshaped the course of World War II and the post-war world. The victory of the Soviets at Kursk symbolized not only their military superiority, but also the strength of the Soviet resolve. It was the beginning of the Soviet Union's push westward and ultimately led to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Kursk was a battle that proved resilience could overcome even the most advanced technology, and coordination and preparation could triumph over brute force. The battle's impact on World War II, Cold War politics, and the legacy of military strategy cannot be overstated. Today, Kursk stands as a monument to sacrifice, courage, and the brutality of war. It is a reminder of the high cost of military conflict and the importance of strategy, unity, and determination in the pursuit of victory. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of one era of military doctrine and the beginning of another. Before Kursk, much of the focus in military strategy had been on offensive operations, using speed, surprise, and maneuver to break through enemy lines and secure rapid victories. The success of the German blitzkrieg tactics early in the war demonstrated how mobility and offensive action could crush a well-organized but relatively immobile force. However, Kursk shattered this belief in unstoppable offenses and made it clear that no matter how superior one side's technology, a well-prepared defense could still turn the tide. The Soviets showed that defense in depth, coupled with resilience and counteroffensives, could defeat even the most powerful military on Earth. The impact of Kursk on military philosophy was profound. After the battle, defensive tactics became central to military thinking. The concept of fortified defensive positions and preparedness to absorb an initial blow was integrated into post-war Soviet military doctrine. This shift led to the development of what is now known as deep battle, a doctrine where the defense is organized into multiple lines of defense, allowing for counterattacks that can exploit weaknesses in the enemy's offensive. One of the key legacies of Kursk was its pivotal role in shaping the evolution of tank warfare. The tanks used during the battle, the Soviet T-34, German Tiger and Panther tanks, were the most advanced machines of their time, but they had fundamental differences that would go on to define tank development in the years that followed. The T-34, with its sloped armor and more efficient production techniques, was designed to outpace the German tanks. Despite not being as heavily armored as the Tiger I, the T-34's mobility and reliability made it a powerful weapon in the Soviet arsenal. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated that speed and ease of production could outweigh raw firepower and armor, especially when the defending force could replace losses at a faster rate than the attacking force. On the German side, the Tiger I tank with its fearsome 88mm gun was a force to be reckoned with, but it was plagued by issues of mechanical breakdowns and its inability to keep up with the speed of the battlefield. The Panther tank, considered an improvement on the Tiger, was faster and more maneuverable, but still faced issues with its mechanics under battlefield conditions. Kursk demonstrated that advanced technology was not enough without reliability and logistical support. In the decades following the battle, these lessons were absorbed into modern armored tactics. Today's tanks, such as the M1 Abrams and Leopard 2, draw on the principles demonstrated at Kursk: reliability, mobility, and integration with infantry and artillery, to form the backbone of armored divisions. After World War II, the world was plunged into the Cold War, and the lessons from Kursk played a crucial role in shaping military technology during this period. The United States and the Soviet Union, now locked in an ideological and nuclear standoff, sought to create military technologies that would give them the upper hand in a potential conflict. The Soviet Union, with its victory at Kursk, continued to build on the success of the T-34 and developed the T-55 and later the T-72. These tanks became the backbone of Soviet armored forces throughout the Cold War. Much like the T-34 at Kursk, the T-55 was simple, reliable, and designed for mass production. It was an effective counter to the NATO tanks of the time, which were designed with heavy armor and firepower, but often lacked the Soviet focus on speed and mobility. For NATO, Kursk highlighted the need to develop tanks that were both well-armored and mobile. This would lead to the development of the M60 Patton tank in the United States, and later, the M1 Abrams. These modern tanks, with their advanced targeting systems, composite armor, and superior mobility, were directly influenced by the lessons learned at Kursk. The importance of combining firepower, mobility, and reliability. The tank battles of the Cold War, particularly during the 1973 Yom Kippur War and in Eastern Europe, were directly influenced by the outcomes of Kursk. The importance of tank fleets in massive confrontations would echo in the defense strategies of both the Soviets and NATO, and the lessons of Kursk about how armor, infantry, and artillery must work in tandem would continue to define the doctrines of the major military powers. The symbolism of Kursk cannot be understated. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Kursk became an emblem of Soviet strength and resilience. The Red Army's victory was not just about military superiority. It was about national pride and the Soviet system's resilience in the face of an overwhelming enemy. In the years after World War II, the Soviet government used the victory at Kursk to further cement the role of Stalin and the Communist Party as the ultimate force behind the Soviet triumph. The battle was portrayed as a heroic struggle against the fascist invaders, and Kursk was commemorated as a victory of the working class and the Soviet people over Nazi oppression. Kursk became one of the defining symbols of Soviet patriotism, with Soviet war films, monuments, and memorials dedicated to those who fought and died in the battle. For the German people, however, Kursk represented a moment of profound humiliation. While the Germans were not defeated at Kursk in the sense that they lost the battle on the first day, the failure of Operation Citadel was a blow to their strategy and morale. The battle's aftermath contributed to the fall of Nazi Germany and the psychological toll of the war. The battle exposed the vulnerabilities of the German military system, and for Germany, Kursk became part of the larger memory of defeat and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. Looking back, Kursk stands as one of the most significant and defining moments of World War II. It was not just a clash of tanks, it was a battle of ideologies, technologies, and resilience. It was a battle where the Soviets, despite being under constant threat of Nazi aggression, proved that their defensive preparations and counteroffensive tactics could overcome the most formidable military machine of the time. The victory at Kursk demonstrated the importance of preparation, coordination, and adaptability in modern warfare. It was a battle that helped shift the balance of power on the Eastern Front and ultimately led to the defeat of Nazi Germany. For the Soviets, Kursk was the beginning of their triumphant march toward Berlin, and for the Germans, it was the beginning of a series of defeats that would culminate in the collapse of the Third Reich. In the larger context of World War II, Kursk marked a turning point where the Soviets seized the initiative and began a series of offensives that would eventually lead to the fall of Berlin and the defeat of Nazi Germany. The strategic lessons learned in the battle continue to shape modern warfare and tank tactics, while Kursk itself remains a symbol of resilience, determination, and the cost of war. Thank you for joining us as we explored the Battle of Kursk and its lasting impact on history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with friends who are interested in World War II. Drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts on the importance of Kursk in the broader context of the war. What lessons do you think we can still apply today? Stay tuned for more stories about the pivotal moments that changed the world.